Well, gardens have been a very important aspect of my my everyday life and also my professional life in a way that I hadn't understood, first of all, when I came to Kansas. But my mother really probably introduced me to plants in the most significant way. She was really what I would call a plants woman. She really knew botanical names and knew where you could plant something and how you could look after it and when to plant it and when to move it and all those sort of issues. And as a child, I was really not very interested in that at all. You know, I loved being in the garden. Being in nature was something that I was given by my family in a very profound way. But as I moved away from home, and first of all I was in London and had a tiny garden, and I started to realize I really wanted to garden. And then eventually I moved to the States and arrived in Kansas, and Kansas is not a very easy place to grow plants at all. It's, you know, very extreme weather, extreme heat and dust, and I don't need to tell you all that because most people know because they live here. But anyway, so for years I've been trying to establish gardens here. I started off with annuals, foolishly, and British plants that didn't like it here, and they'd raise their little heads and be horrified and die. And so I learnt to try and put in prairie plants and much more sustainable plants that enjoy this environment. So I'm standing at the back of the garden, and the garden spreads all the way around in this little protected area here. It's a fairly free-form sort of process. I don't always think about what plant is going to be next to which. It's more to do with, in terms of visual energy, it's more to do with surprise, and also who, if I think of them as people, who will grow in one place better than another. So sometimes I have odd juxtapositions of plants, and that's actually very interesting and relates very much to my practice in the studio, where I'm very involved in trying to create metaphors about the cycles of life, you know, from birth to this sort of ecstasy and ecstatic nature of a younger middle life, and then, you know, a decline through into fall and down towards mortality. And I'm sort of really, I think as a gardener, all gardeners have mortality at the back of their mind, you know, as we all do. The older we get, the more we understand how little time there is. And so I think as I'm gardening and involved in this excitement in the summer, I'm always aware of how extraordinary the garden is. You know, in the winter, it's so bleak. You know, there's not a green thing in sight. And I'm used to, actually in England, often there are green things in sight in the winter. So this is a very extreme situation that occurs here. So I'm always very excited when spring comes, of course, you know, and in the winter I spend all my time in my catalogues trying to think, like, you know, could I try this plant that says it wants moisture? Maybe not, but maybe I'll try it anyway. So I put it in and it goes, oh God, take me to North America, take me away from Kansas. So, you know, there are very often disasters in the garden, which is really very interesting because there are disasters in painting too, you know. Things die, ideas don't work, issues that you push, you go down wrong avenues. And so I think there is a symbiotic relationship between the process of gardening and the process of painting. And I would even say that I have a collaboration now between everything that is here and everything I'm trying to say in the studio. In relationship to how the garden appears, you know, it's probably a very, it's not wild looking, but it is, I think Gretchen used a great word, unruly, and I would use that word. I think there is an unruly character to the garden, and I'm very attracted to that. And, you know, historically in English gardens, there's all kinds of means of putting together a garden. There's the very formal gardens in France, which the British were a little influenced by, but as we move towards the 18th and 19th century, gardeners like someone like Gertrude Jekyll, who really believed in having cultivated plants closer to the house and a sort of free form of movement through the garden, maybe with paths, and then slowly the garden becomes wild. And so it goes from, you know, man-made interaction, not interference, but interaction, I suppose, with the plants, through to really what the natural world does, and then trying to curate the natural world, which is a whole issue in of itself. But so I would say that I'm probably very influenced by that, but I also think that temperamentally I really love the unruly nature, the sort of free-form nature, because in the garden, and if you look into the garden, you see all these different structures of plants. So large leaves, small leaves, you know, plants that explode, like the cleome that's like a firework, plants that hug the ground, you know, large leaves, and then the breaking of light across that surface is really fascinating as well. And so as a gardener, I find myself, because I walk every single day, actually I have paths out in the north, and I walk here and try and get a sort of a 3 or 4 mile circuit out of walking through a labyrinth of paths, so that I have this conversation with the place. And as I walk, I think, and get ideas for my paintings, but I also spend just hours just standing around in the garden, trying to absorb the unexpected juxtapositions of plants and insects, or the way light falls. And so it's a very inspirational place. Well, Zenith is a painting that I've been working on for many, many years, and you know, of course, thought it was finished in 2014, and having this great opportunity to present it to the Art Center, I realized, and it's been sort of bugging me. I do yoga in front of it, and when it's in the North Room out there, and when I'm doing it, I'm always getting these ideas about, like, why did I do that? Why didn't I change this? I could, you know, increase the light here, or whatever it would be. So I decided that I would just do the things that I wanted to do to it rather than waiting. So it's been under paint since 2014, but actually before that it was a large abstract painting, and in some ways that makes sense of maybe my story of being here in Kansas and my relationship to place. When I was in England, I was painting at the same scale, and I was painting large English abstracted landscapes with much larger mark making and probably less contrast of language in the paint. I was using much more gestural work. I really loved the idea of the body, the physicality of the body, and being inside the canvas. You know, you can stretching up high. So there are other examples in the studio of more abstract work. So this was a painting. So when I came to Kansas, it was really hard to be here. It was really hard to understand how to be in this place, which is so very different from where I came from. You know, England is a very intimate landscape. Kansas is extremely vast. I felt like I was sleeping in a bedroom where the bed was at an angle in the bedroom. I had no location to walls. I felt completely disoriented. And the first paintings that I painted at this scale here, I really wanted to return to that large way of painting. I love painting at that scale, the sort of body relationship of the physicality. So I painted paintings where I was off the ground, which is very interesting. Now I realize I felt very disoriented. And so this painting was a painting of the night. And so it was a very dark painting. You can see some of the remains, well, vaguely, some of the remains of this sort of mark making to try and get the scintillation of darkness, which of course is, you know, an oxymoron, really. I mean, you can't really get dark to scintillate. You know, you have to pour light into it and it's dark. So it was a very complicated problem, and it stayed like that. And I probably started it maybe about 20 years ago. So it stayed like that as a finished painting and was shown in various places. And then, you know, it's sitting around in the studio, and anything that's in the studio is up for grabs to paint. You know, nothing is ever really finished in my mind. Because we sort of move on. I've moved on with ideas, and so I came back and started to build this enormous arcing structure across the painting. And it, you know, first of all it was a river, and then it was, you know, a garden, and then I sort of slowed down and realized that I was profoundly interested actually in the scintillation of light in the garden and the structures of plants that are inside the garden. So, and I sort of quieted myself down and had made another painting a little bit smaller before that, where I had lifted out the structures of plants and juxtapositioned them without thinking about the logic of, or not allowing myself to let go of really the logic of scale relationship, or you know, the environment that lies between things. So i.e., you know, a logical progression from large to small or small to large, and was expanding very, very small parts of the garden to a much larger scale, and it was an incredibly exciting thing to be doing. So in this painting you'll see, for example, up here, I mean, this is probably the most obvious structural part of the painting in a sense. Actually, this originally was way down here. And I think it was down here. So I think I turned this painting up the other way and moved it over here. So at one point, you know, the panels didn't even stay in the same place. So it's all very open to suggestion, I think, painting, in terms of what one's done the day before and coming into the studio and reacting to that. So in this, going back to this structure, it relates to the double helix, which is sort of the central structure of growth structure in the natural world. You know, two concentric spirals that overlap each other, and comes, I mean, the most obvious plant is the sunflower that has that structure in its middle. But what I loved about the plant world is nothing is, I mean, the idea, that the desire of the plant is perfection, but the plant never really can do it because somebody comes along and eats something, or there's too much water on one side of the plant and not enough on the other. And so you get these uneven, I suppose you could say, sort of blemishes in the plant. I'm really interested in how that mimics how we go through our lives as people. So that takes me to the idea of metaphor that is embedded in the painting. So I am very connected to the garden, which you've just seen images of the garden, where there is this almost chaotic energy of plants, and this peak, this zenith of the garden at, well, maybe a little bit earlier, maybe August, you know, when the weather is really hot and everybody's trying to produce seed and everyone's having sex, and no, not everybody, but you know, all the insects are having sex. There's this incredible sort of fecundity in the garden, and wanting to convey that in the painting, but also understanding that inside of reproduction and procreation, there are disasters, there are difficulties, there are failures, that things don't survive, somebody eats somebody, you know, it's a, not in the human world, hopefully, but in the plant world, there is definitely a structure whereby some things fail and some things succeed. So I'm very interested in the distortion that takes me back to this, where that occurs. Then as you move over, I'm sort of allowing myself to release, for example, the stamens from a lily from their stems. And the ovulum and the female part of the plant, although it looks very male, I agree, you know, is coming out, moving out of the space. And I'm not worrying about, in this particular case, about the structure of the plant. It feels like it's too literal for this painting. But, you know, then I am looking very specifically at, this is actually a noxious weed, right? A noxious weed. It's the thistle, which is so beautiful. I think it's a Scottish thistle. I don't know. It's beautiful. I always am very sad when they spray it, but it does take over a bit. But there was one growing in the middle of my lawn, so I thought, okay, I'm not meant to keep it, but I'm going to keep it.
this naughty, wild, noxious weed. So I love the sensation of the softness there, and then, you know, of course, all the insects that visit the plant. So here is a wasp visiting the plant. And then I wanted to flip the space. I don't know that this is quite finished, but it probably, for the moment, it's finished. But this is sort of like the top of that, really. So this is like the sort of, I suppose, like a cauldron of movement in this middle part, which is trying to mimic the energy and light and sort of frenetic confusion of the center of this Zenith painting. And here there's a little green bee, you know, which in real life is tiny. But the idea in the painting is to try and move the viewer's eye across the painting, hoping that there will be surprises that people will find later. So it's not all immediately in your face. I mean, it's very busy, and I think at this point in the painting, it's really complicated because I made decisions 6 years ago to emphasize certain parts, and so I'm sort of having to respect that to a degree, and so essentially the structure is remaining, although I am changing, I think, quite a few things over here in the night. I don't know whether you can see over there in the night panel. And I can talk a little bit about that in terms of maybe the metaphor that I'm really interested in promoting in the painting. So in the first panel, you have sort of almost a dawning of light, moving into a frenetic center, although there is, you know, an energy already roiling in the first part. So this energy, and then this fading, not fading, but maybe encroachment of dark, or the shifting of the light into the dark, and thinking about the sounds of the dark. And this part I think I'm going to work on, which is a little scary. But what I wanted was the sound of the cicada at night, but I don't think it really does that. I think that, I was talking to a curator for anyway, it doesn't matter who it was, but he was saying to me, oh, you know, I think of that as birth, Mary. And I'm thinking like, oh, do I like that? Well, I don't know. I mean, I sort of do, because it's like this birthing in the dark, in the night. And so I'm sort of torn between wanting to create the sound and then having this other idea that was given to me. And so I'm sort of working my way with that. And so as you move into the dark, there is this entanglement of a web of a spider. And I don't know whether you know these spiders, but there are, you know, for example, in the woodland where I walk in the hedgerow, it's not really woodland, at the moment the floor of the woodland is covered in these spiders' nests. You know, they make this entangled nest between the sort of roots and ground and plants and leaves, and then there's this beautiful hole right in the middle that is woven finely of the web. So I've always been really intrigued by that, and I love the idea that ooh, it's dusty. Anyway, sorry. It's been sitting around, like, this is going to have to do a little bit of cleaning here. Anyway, so I love the idea that you go from this incredible exuberance and celebration of life towards the dark, which of course we think of in terms of the unknown, a mysterious place, a place of infinity, which of course is so hard to paint in painting, and then, you know, eventually of mortality, you know. So I'm hoping to bring the viewer to eventually this spider's web, and there's a hole in the middle here. There really is a lot of dust here. I'm going to have to do something about that. and the sense that the sort of detritus of the natural world gets caught in the web. So there are a few characters that have, you know, their demise towards mortality. And I suppose it's a reminder for myself, and hopefully that we are all very cognizant of the moment, you know, being present, being here in the vitality of life and the exuberance of the natural world. I haven't really talked probably that much about the natural world, but, you know, it's kind of central, put it like that.